The first thing she noticed when she woke was the warmth. Not the cold stone floor beneath her hip, not the thin layer of straw pressing into her cheek, not even the dull ache that had settled into her lower back sometime in the night. It was the warmth, solid, breathing, alive, pressed against her spine like a wall that had decided to be gentle. Sadie opened her eyes slowly. The stable was still dark. Pale gray light filtered through the high gaps in the wooden slats, the kind of light that came before sunrise, when the world hadn't yet committed to morning. She could hear the soft movement of horses in the far stalls, the occasional snort, the creak of the building settling against the wind outside. The smell was hay and damp earth, and something else, something wild and faintly resinous, like pine crushed underfoot in a forest she had never visited. She turned her head, carefully, because every part of her body had a complaint. The wolf was enormous. She was lying on her side, her massive silver-gray flank rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm, her heavy head resting just beyond Sadie's shoulder, as though she had positioned herself there with intention. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was deep and unhurried. And her belly, round, impossibly full, pressed against the back of Sadie's legs with the calm weight of something utterly certain of its own right to exist. Pregnant. Heavily, unmistakably pregnant. Sadie should have screamed. She understood that, distantly, the way you understand things, when your body is too exhausted to respond with the emotion the situation deserves. She had fallen asleep in an empty stall. She was absolutely certain of that. She had checked every corner of it before she lay down, because she had learned, in the past 3 months, to check every corner before she allowed herself to be vulnerable. The wolf had not been there. Now the wolf was there, breathing against her, keeping her warm. "Don't move," her mind said. "Don't frighten her." Sadie was not sure who she was protecting, the wolf or herself. She lay still and let herself breathe, and tried to remember how she had arrived here. 3 months ago, Sadie had been married. The ceremony had taken place in the great hall of Veldmore Keep, under candlelight, and the eyes of 200 guests who had eaten the Ashvale Pack's food, drunk their wine, and watched her walk to the altar in a dress that had taken 4 seamstresses 6 weeks to finish. She had worn her mother's pendant, a small crescent moon cast in silver, the only thing left of a woman who had died when Sadie was 9 years old. She had held flowers she didn't choose because her stepmother, Resna, had insisted that lavender was inappropriate for a wedding and replaced them with white roses at the last moment. She had stood beside Fenwick Ashvale and believed, with the whole of her 23 years, that she was beginning something real. Fenwick was the second son of the Ashvale Pack's alpha. He was not remarkable, not in the way alphas were, not with that particular gravity that made rooms quiet when they entered. But he had been kind to her, or what she had understood as kindness. He had spoken to her gently. He had not looked through her the way so many pack males did when they assessed unmated females, calculating rank, bloodline, usefulness. He had looked at her. She had confused being seen with being loved. She understood that now, in the particular way that you understand things only after they have finished destroying you. The first week of the marriage had been ordinary. The second had grown quiet in a way she couldn't name. By the third, Fenwick had stopped coming to their shared chambers and offered no explanation that she believed. She had told herself it was adjustment. She had told herself newly mated pairs found their rhythm in different ways. She had told herself many things, in the privacy of her own mind, in that careful internal voice she had developed as a child in Resna's house, the voice that translated pain into patience. It was Mira who had told her the truth. Mira was a kitchen girl, barely 17, with quick dark eyes and the kind of loyalty that embarrassed people with power. She had appeared at Sadie's door one evening with a tray that contained more food than Sadie had ordered, and underneath the bread, folded into a square so small it might have been missed, a piece of paper. They planned to file the abandonment before the quarter moon. Once the bond is declared void, the Ashvale lands revert to pack law. Your inheritance from your father, the Colwick holdings, the silver mines, the forest territories in the northern ridge, Transfers to pack ownership under the marriage dissolution clause. Fenwick knows. He agreed to it from the beginning. Your stepmother proposed it to Alpha Gideon 6 months before the wedding. I'm sorry. Run. Sadie had read it 3 times. She had sat on the edge of the bed in that too large room and read it 3 times, and each time she finished, she returned to the beginning, because something in her mind kept insisting she had misunderstood a word. Some crucial word that would make the sentence mean something else. There was no such word. The inheritance her father had spent his life building, the mines, the forests, the territories along the northern ridge that 3 generations of her bloodline had defended, had been the target all along. Fenwick had not seen her. He had seen the land behind her, the silver beneath the earth, the trees that could be felled for timber. He had been the instrument. Her stepmother, Resna, who had moved into her father's house the year after he died, and spoken to Sadie always in that measured, careful tone that contained no warmth. Resna had been the architect. The quarter moon was 4 days away. She had packed nothing. She had taken her mother's pendant, the money she had hidden in a small leather pouch behind a loose stone in the bedroom wall. Not much, but enough, and the warmest cloak she owned. She had walked out of Veldmore Keep in the dark, when the guards changed, and the corridor between the east wing and the kitchen passage was briefly unwatched. She had known about that gap because she had made a study of the keep's rhythms, in the way that women in uncertain situations often do. Quietly, and without drawing attention. She had walked for 2 days. She had made it as far as the village of Grenholt, before her body gave its final argument. Her feet were blistered through her boots. She had eaten almost nothing. The cold, a northern cold, the kind that came off the mountains in early winter and meant it, had worked its way through the cloak and settled into her bones. The stable had been unlocked. She had told herself, one night of warmth, then she would find a way forward. That had been last night. The wolf exhaled slowly against her back. Sadie turned, inch by inch, until she was facing the animal. Up close, she was even larger. Larger than any wolf Sadie had seen, and she had grown up in pack territory. She knew wolves. This one was exceptional. Her coat was the silver gray of winter sky before snow, thick and clean despite the stable floor. Her face, even relaxed in sleep, carried something that didn't belong to ordinary animals. A quality of awareness, or perhaps of knowing. Her belly moved. Sadie went very still. The movement came again. Subtle, rhythmic, unmistakable. The pups were alive in there, pressing against the walls of the world that contained them, already impatient to begin. Something opened in Sadie's chest that she didn't have a name for. Not pity. It wasn't pity. Something older and less complicated. She had been cold and frightened and running toward nothing, and this creature had found her and stayed, had pressed warmth against her through the whole of a freezing night. Without thinking, Sadie reached out and placed her hand on the wolf's side. The wolf's eye opened. Gold. Clear and impossibly gold, in the gray light of early morning, and utterly without the blankness of an animal. She looked at Sadie the way a person looks at someone they have been expecting. Sadie did not pull her hand back. "I don't know how you got here," she whispered. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, dried by cold and disuse. "But thank you." The wolf blinked, slow and deliberate, and lowered her head back to the straw. The stable door opened. 3 men stepped inside, and by the way they moved, the silence of it, the practiced readiness, Sadie understood immediately that they were not grooms come to feed the horses. She scrambled upright. Pain fired through her legs, her back, her blistered feet. But she was standing before they reached the stall gate. The first man she didn't recognize. Broad, dark-haired, a long scar running from ear to jaw, dressed in travel clothes of good quality. The clothes of someone who served someone important. The second she didn't recognize either. But both of them had stopped. Both of them were staring past her at the wolf behind her, and the expression on their faces was not aggression. It was something close to reverence. The third man stepped forward. He was tall in a way that reorganized the space around him. Dark coat, no embellishment, the kind of man who didn't need decoration to announce himself. His hair was dark, cut close. His jaw was sharp. His eyes, when they found her, were a pale gray so light they were almost silver. He looked at her in the stall with the pregnant wolf standing behind her, Sadie's hand still resting on the animal's flank. Sadie herself disheveled and exhausted and braced for whatever came next. And he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that carried no performance in it at all, "She doesn't let anyone touch her." Sadie lifted her chin. "She came to me." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise. Something more careful than surprise. "I know," he said. "I've been following her track since midnight." He looked at her the way she had not been looked at in a very long time. Not assessed, not calculated, simply seen. It lasted only a moment. Then his expression returned to that controlled stillness, and he said very quietly, "You're hurt." It was not a question. "I'm fine," Sadie said, which was the most comprehensive lie she had told in 3 months of lying. The wolf behind her made a low sound. Not a growl, not quite. Something between announcement and insistence. The man's pale eyes moved to the wolf, and whatever passed between them, whatever language existed in that exchange, it settled something in his posture. He looked back at Sadie. "My name is Caius," he said, "and I think we need to get you both somewhere warm." Sadie did not get into the carriage willingly. She stood at the stable door with the cold morning pressing against her face and assessed the situation the way she had learned to assess things, methodically, without letting fear make the decisions. There was a carriage waiting in the narrow road beside the inn, black and unmarked, pulled by 2 horses whose breath came in thick clouds in the winter air. There were the 2 men she didn't recognize, positioned with the particular stillness of trained guards. And there was Caius, standing a few feet from her, not pressing, not moving closer, simply waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that patience was its own form of authority. The wolf had walked out of the stable ahead of all of them. That was the detail that kept Sadie from running. The animal had risen from the straw, shaken herself once, and walked directly to the carriage as though she had ridden in carriages before and found them acceptable. She had looked back at Sadie from the step, that gold gaze, direct and expecting, and waited. "She's never done that for anyone," said the guard with the scar, to no one in particular. Sadie looked at Caius. "Who is she?" "Her name is Sable." He paused. "She's mine. Your wolf." "My wolf," he confirmed, and something in the simplicity of it, the lack of explanation, the absence of the elaborate status marking that pack males usually performed when naming their animals or their rank or their territory, made her study him more carefully. He wore no insignia, no pack markings on his coat, no ring that she could identify. His boots were good leather, well-maintained but not new. He could have been a wealthy merchant. He could have been a commander of some regional force. He could have been anything. But Sable had chosen her in the dark, and Sable was his. And that meant something Sadie hadn't worked out yet. She got into the carriage. They rode for most of the morning. Sadie sat on one side with Sable's heavy head resting across her knees. The wolf had arranged herself across the carriage floor with calm certainty, as though the decision had been made long before any of them. And Caius sat across from her, watching the window. He did not attempt conversation. He did not ask her questions. He did not perform the particular kind of attentiveness that men performed when they wanted something from a woman they had just met. He simply occupied the space, quietly and completely, and let her think. Sadie spent the first hour planning her escape from this carriage. She spent the second hour admitting that her feet were too damaged to walk on, that she had perhaps 4 coins left in her pouch, that she did not know this road, and that Sable was lying across her legs with the comfortable authority of someone who had decided the matter was settled. She spent the third hour looking, carefully and sideways, at the man across from her. He was not what she would have called handsome in the way that Fenwick had been. Fenwick's face had been arranged into pleasantness, something that cooperated with being looked at. Caius's face did no such thing. It was harder than that, more angular, the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and decision, rather than groomed into appeal. There was a scar along his left hand, she noticed. Not long, but deep, the kind that came from something deliberate. He caught her looking. She did not look away. She had learned not to look away from things. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the true part of the answer." He turned from the window. "The full answer requires knowing more about your situation than you've told me, which is nothing." "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You don't." The carriage shifted over a rough patch of road, and Sable made a low sound of displeasure at the movement. Sadie's hand moved to the wolf's side without thinking, a steadying gesture, instinctive, and Sable settled. Caius watched this with an expression she couldn't read. "She was due 3 weeks ago," he said, quietly. "She kept disappearing from the grounds. I've had men searching for her every night." He paused. "She's never stayed anywhere longer than an hour. Until apparently she decided to spend the night in a stable in Grenholt. With a stranger. With you." The distinction in his tone was slight. She caught it anyway. "I don't know what that means," Sadie said. "Neither do I yet," he said. And he sounded for the first time like he was telling her the exact truth. The estate was called Dravenmore. It appeared out of the tree line in the late afternoon. Stone walls the color of winter cloud, towers that didn't announce themselves but simply rose, a gate that opened before the carriage reached it, guards who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been trained well and trusted their own judgment. The grounds were large and dark with old trees, the kind that had been there long enough to become part of the place's character rather than decoration. It was not a cheerful house, but it was solid. It had the quality of something that would still be standing long after everything around it had changed. Sadie stepped down from the carriage into cold air that smelled of pine and wood smoke and frost, and a woman came down the front steps before anyone spoke. Middle-aged, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing the practical dress of someone who ran a household and had no patience for ceremony. "She's here, then," the woman said, and it took Sadie a moment to realize she was looking not at her, but at Sable, who had descended from the carriage and was already moving toward the entrance with the unhurried certainty of someone returning home. "Sable came back," Caius said. "She wasn't alone." The woman looked at Sadie then. Her eyes were sharp and not unkind. "You look like you haven't eaten in 2 days." 3, Sadie said, before she could stop herself. The woman's expression tightened briefly, not with judgment, with something more like controlled anger directed at circumstances rather than at her. "Come inside," she said. "I'm Helda. I manage this house." They gave her a room on the second floor. It was not an elaborate room, but it had been prepared with the kind of care that communicated intention. Clean linen, a fire already burning in the small hearth, a basin of warm water on the stand, a tray with bread and broth, and a wedge of hard cheese. A dress had been laid across the chair. Simple gray wool, clearly not new but clean and whole and approximately her size. Someone had anticipated her. Sadie stood in the center of the room for a long moment after Helda left her, and looked at the fire, and tried to decide what she felt. What she felt, she realized, was suspicious. Generosity had a cost. She had learned this in her stepmother's house, where kindnesses were always denominated and eventually collected. She had learned it in Fenwick's careful courtship, in the soft-spoken attention that had turned out to be an investment strategy. Warmth that appeared without explanation was warmth that wanted something. She ate anyway, because refusing food on principle while her body was failing was the kind of pride she couldn't afford. The broth was good. The bread was dense and dark and real. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate all of it, and felt, by the end, slightly more capable of thought. There was a soft sound at the door, not a knock, lower than that. She opened it. Sable stood in the corridor, looking at her with those gold eyes. "How did you get up the stairs?" Sadie asked. The wolf appeared to find this an uninteresting question. She moved past Sadie into the room, turned twice at the foot of the bed, and lay down with a long exhale. Sadie looked at her for a moment. Then she closed the door and sat back on the bed. "You can stay," she told the wolf. "But I'm not staying. Not permanently. I need to think." Sable put her head on her paws and closed her eyes. Sadie sat with the fire and let herself think. The inheritance, the mines and the forests and the northern territories. Everything her father had built. Everything he had named for her in the documents she had never been allowed to read herself, because Resna had said she would find them tedious. Because Resna had said she would explain the important parts when the time came. The time had come in the form of a piece of paper hidden under bread by a 17-year-old kitchen girl, and the important parts had been, they are going to take everything and discard you once it's done. She needed those documents. They were in Veldmore Keep. In the study that had once been her father's, that Resna had repurposed into something colder and more administrative, the documents that proved the Colwick holdings belonged to her by direct inheritance, not to a pack, not to a husband's bloodline, not to a woman who had married a dead man's grief and redecorated his study. She needed to go back, not to stay, to take what was hers. She fell asleep before she finished planning how. She woke to voices in the corridor, low, male, careful. 2 of them. She did not move. She lay in the gray early light and listened with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that information arrived most honestly when people didn't know they were being heard. "She has no pack," one voice said, the guard with the scar. "She has no protection," the other voice said, Caius. "There's a difference." A pause. "The Ashvale Alpha filed a search yesterday," the first voice said. "Missing mate. That's the language they're using." Silence. "They won't call it what it is," Caius said. His voice had not changed in volume or speed, but something in it had shifted, the way a river shifts when the ground beneath it drops. "She isn't missing. She left. And she left because she found out what they intended." "How do you know what she found out?" "Because she's here instead of dead," Caius said. "Which means she moved before the quarter moon. Which means someone warned her." Another silence. Longer. "Ashvale has reach," the first voice said. "So do I," said Caius. And then, quieter. "Make sure the gate is doubled tonight." Sadie lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and understood with absolute clarity that she had traded one complicated situation for another. That this man knew more about her circumstances than she had told him. That he had taken her in, taken Sable's choice as a reason to take her in, and had already begun moving pieces on her behalf without asking her permission. She understood all of this. She also understood, when she placed her hand against Sable's warm side in the dark, that she was alive and warm and had eaten, and that someone had doubled the gate. For now, she told herself. This was for now. She found him in the library before breakfast. Sadie had woken early, dressed in the gray wool dress that fit her well enough, and spent 20 minutes sitting on the edge of the bed convincing herself that the correct course of action was to ask direct questions, rather than gather information in corners. She had spent 3 months being careful and quiet and observant, and it had kept her alive, but it had not returned what was taken from her. Silence was a survival tool. It was not a recovery tool. She needed different tools now. The library was on the ground floor, at the end of a corridor lined with dark wood paneling and 2 iron sconces that had burned down to stubs overnight. The door was ajar. She pushed it open. Caius was standing at the large table in the center of the room, not sitting, standing, with the posture of someone who had been there long enough that standing had become the resting state. There were papers spread across the table, and a candle burned low beside them. And he was reading with the focused stillness of a man who had trained himself not to be interrupted by the world's ambient noise. He looked up when she entered. She did not apologize for the intrusion. "I need to know what you know about the Ashvale pack," she said. And I need to know why you know it." He studied her for a moment. Then he straightened and gestured to the chair across the table. She sat. He remained standing. Not as a power gesture, she thought, but because he was the kind of man who processed things better in motion, or at least in the readiness for it. "How much do you know about your own inheritance?" he asked. "I know my father left me the Colwick holdings, the silver mines along the Drave Ridge, the forest territories in the north, the grazing lands and the mill at Colwick proper." She paused. "I know I've never actually held the documents myself. My stepmother managed the estate after my father died, and told me the paperwork was being handled by the Pack solicitors." "It was," Caius said, "being handled in the sense that it was being quietly restructured." Sadie kept her expression steady. "Explain that." He pulled one of the papers from the table and set it in front of her. She looked at it. A copy of something, written in a careful administrative hand, dense with legal language. Her eyes moved through it quickly. She had not been educated in law, but she had been educated. Her father had insisted on that. One of the few gifts she was certain had been purely his. And she could read well enough to understand the shape of what she was looking at. It was a transfer document. It bore her name and Fenwick Ashvale's name, and a date 6 weeks before the wedding. "This was signed before I married him," she said. "It was signed with your name before you married him," Caius said. "Whether your hand wrote it is a different question." The room was very quiet. Sadie set the paper down carefully. "How did you get this?" "I have a man inside Veldmore Keep," he said. "He's been there for 8 months." 8 months? She looked up. "You've been watching the Ashvale Pack for 8 months." "I've been watching what the Ashvale Pack was doing with the Colwick territories for 8 months, he said. "The silver mines on the Drave Ridge border my territory. What happens to them is not a matter of indifference to me." And there it was. The clean, plain reason. She had wondered when it would arrive. The explanation for his involvement that reduced it to the logical and the strategic, the reason that had nothing to do with her specifically, and everything to do with land and silver, and the particular geometry of territorial power. She should not have felt disappointed. She had known better than to expect anything else. "So, I'm useful to you," she said. "Because my inheritance is adjacent to your territory." Caius looked at her with those pale silver eyes, and she had the unsettling impression that he was listening to something beneath the words she was saying. Some frequency she hadn't intended to broadcast. "Your inheritance is useful to me," he said carefully. "You are a separate matter." "I'd prefer not to be a matter at all," she said. "I'd prefer to be a person making decisions." Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, exactly, but opened. The way a window opens to let in a different quality of air. "Then make them," he said. "I'm not stopping you. You doubled the gate last night. To keep the Ashvale guard out," he said. "Not to keep you in." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or explanation, or the particular kind of verbal padding that men used when they were trying to manage a woman's suspicion, rather than address it. "I need the original documents," she said finally. "The ones in my father's study in Veldmore Keep. The actual inheritance records, signed in his hand before he died." "I know. I need to go back for them." "I know that too. I'm not asking for your permission," she said. "I'm not offering my permission," he said. "I'm offering a plan." The plan took 3 days to assemble. Sadie spent those 3 days in a state of controlled motion, learning the layout of Dravenmore, speaking with Helda, who turned out to be forthcoming in the manner of practical people who respect directness, and spending hours at the library table, going through every document Caius's man inside Veldmore had managed to copy. What she found, piece by piece, was worse than she had imagined. The forged transfer document was only the beginning. Beneath it was a letter from Resna to Alpha Gideon Ashvale, written 2 years before Sadie's father died, proposing the arrangement in clear terms: the marriage, the transfer, the dissolution. Resna had planned it while her husband was still alive, while Sadie had still been living in her father's house, believing she was in her father's house. There was a second letter. This one made Sadie's hands go still on the table. It was from Resna to someone identified only as the warden of the Eastern Hold, a name she didn't recognize, discussing the transfer of a ward. A male ward, age 11 at the time of writing, described as the Colwick heir's illegitimate issue, and therefore without legal claim, but potential nuisance value if left unmanaged. Her brother. Sadie had not thought of Edmund in months, because thinking of Edmund was the one thing that had the power to break the controlled interior voice into something that couldn't be reassembled quickly. Edmund was not illegitimate. He was her half-brother, born of her father's first marriage before her mother, which made his claim to the Colwick name legitimate and documented. The letter was lying about that deliberately, making him into something that could be moved and stored and forgotten. He would be 14 now. "Where is the Eastern Hold?" she asked, when Caius came into the library that evening. He looked at the letter she was holding. His jaw tightened slightly. 3 days north of Veldmoor. It's a prison. It's called a hold, he said. The function is the same. He was 11 when they sent him there. Her voice was steady. She had decided it would be steady. He was a child. I know. He said it without qualification or softening. My man didn't find the letter until last month. We didn't know about your brother until then. She filed that away, the implication of a longer operation, more people involved than the 2 guards she had seen. He's part of this, she said. Getting him out is part of this. Yes, Caius said simply. She looked at him. That's not just a territorial concern. The Eastern Hold isn't near your borders. No, he agreed. Then why? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She was learning the difference between his silences. This one was the silence of someone choosing exact words rather than approximate ones. Because it's wrong, he said. And because you deserve to have someone in your corner who doesn't require the wrong to be convenient for them before they acknowledge it. The fire crackled in the hearth. Sable, who had established the library hearthrug as her primary residence over the past 3 days, lifted her head briefly and then set it back down. Sadie turned back to the documents. Tell me about the plan, she said. It was Helda who noticed first. She came to Sadie's room on the 3rd evening with a fresh candle and a look on her face that was measuring in a way that had nothing to do with the candle. You should rest more, Helda said. You're running on anger and bread. Anger and bread have taken me further than most things, Sadie said. Helda set the candle down and looked at her with the directness of a woman who had spent decades in a household that valued honesty. He hasn't slept properly in 2 days either, she said, since you arrived. Sadie kept her eyes on the document in front of her. That's his concern. It is, Helda agreed. I'm not telling you to do anything about it. I'm telling you because you're the kind of woman who notices things. And I'd rather you notice it from me than misread it on your own. She paused at the door. He doesn't bring people here, as a rule. In 8 years of managing this house, I have seen him bring exactly 2 people inside these walls. One was a wounded soldier from the southern border skirmish. She paused. The other is you. She left. Sadie sat with the candle and the documents and the weight of that information, and deliberately did not examine what it meant, because she had made herself a promise in the carriage on the first day. She would not let herself be rearranged by kindness. She had been rearranged by kindness before, and she knew what it cost. But she sat with Sable warm against her feet, and the fire burning low, and the candle Helda had brought casting clean gold light across her father's stolen documents, and something in her chest, something that had been cold and shut and braced since the morning she read Mira's note, shifted, slightly, without her permission. She pressed her hand to it, internally, like pressing a bruise. Not yet, she told herself. Not until Edmund is home. Outside, snow had begun to fall on Dravenmoor's dark grounds, quiet and indifferent, covering the tracks that led both toward the estate and away from it. Tomorrow they would begin. They left Dravenmore before dawn. Sadie rode in the carriage with Helda's traveling cloak around her shoulders, heavier than her own, lined with dark wool, smelling of cedar and something faintly herbal, and a set of documents tucked inside her bodice that Caius's man had spent 3 days forging with careful precision. Not forgeries meant to deceive a court. Forgeries meant to get them through the Veldmore keep gates long enough to reach the study before anyone understood what was happening. The plan was not elegant. Elegant plans, Caius had said, the night before, while standing at the library table with the candlelight making his face look carved from something older than stone. Elegant plans assumed that everyone behaved predictably. He preferred plans with contingencies. Sadie had counted 4 contingencies in his explanation. She had added a 5th herself, and he had listened to it without interrupting, and then nodded once, and incorporated it without comment. She had noticed that. The way he listened, not waiting for her to finish so he could respond, but actually taking in what she said, and adjusting. She had not encountered that particular quality often enough to stop noticing it. Sable had been left at Dravenmore. That had been the only moment of genuine argument. The wolf had planted herself at the carriage step with the immovable authority of her condition, and Caius had crouched in front of her and spoken to her quietly, in a tone that Sadie hadn't been able to hear from a distance, but that had carried the particular quality of someone explaining something to an equal, rather than commanding a subordinate. Eventually, Sable had risen, turned, and walked back toward the house. She had not looked back, but she had paused once at the door and looked at Sadie, and the gold of her eyes in the early dark had been so clear and so direct that Sadie had felt it somewhere behind her sternum. "Come back," she had translated, though she knew she might be wrong. She intended to. Veldmore Keep appeared on the second afternoon. Sadie had not expected the feeling that arrived with it. Not fear, though fear was present, but something more specific and more humiliating. The sight of those walls produced in her a physical response she hadn't anticipated. Her hands went cold, her throat tightened, and for a moment she was back in the too-large bedroom reading a piece of paper hidden under bread, reading it 3 times because her mind kept refusing to accept what the words plainly said. She breathed through it. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. A technique her father had taught her for managing horses. Steady your breath and they'll steady theirs, that she had adapted over the years for managing herself. Caius was watching her from across the carriage. "I'm fine," she said. "You don't have to be," he said. It was such a simple thing to say. She didn't know what to do with it, so she looked back at the window and watched the keep grow larger. The gate captain accepted the documents with the incurious efficiency of someone who processed a great deal of paperwork and had made his peace with it. The forged letters identified Sadie as returning under pack escort for a formal property inventory, standard procedure in the case of a contested marital dissolution, language the captain clearly recognized and found unremarkable. Caius and his 2 guards were listed as legal witnesses. They were waved through. The inner courtyard smelled exactly as she remembered, cold stone and horse manure, and faintly, the pine resin from the torches that burned in the iron brackets along the main wall. The smell hit her like a flat hand against the chest. Not painful, exactly, but forceful. She made herself walk at a steady pace. The study had been her father's. She found it at the end of the east corridor, past the tapestry of the winter hunt that had hung there since before she was born, past the door to what had been her childhood room, past a window that looked out over the inner garden, where the rose bushes had been cut back to stubs for winter and stood in their trimmed rows like something waiting to be allowed to grow again. The door was unlocked. She had counted on that. The pack solicitors had been in and out of the study for months, and administrative convenience tended to win over security in houses where no one expected a threat from inside. She went directly to the 3rd drawer of the left cabinet, behind the false back that her father had shown her when she was 12, pressing her small hand against the panel and telling her, "Everything important goes here, because important things deserve to be protected." The panel opened. The documents were there. Her hands were shaking slightly as she pulled them out. She noticed this with detached interest, as though observing someone else's hands. The original inheritance records. Her father's signature at the bottom of each page in the particular slanted hand she would have recognized in a dark room. The full deed to the Colwick holdings, the mining rights, the forest territories, the mill. Her name, written clearly. Sadie Colwick, sole and direct heir. Not a wife's inheritance. Not a pack acquisition. Hers. Her name in her father's hand, with witnesses' signatures, and the wax seal of the regional recorder that no one could dispute in a legitimate court. She pressed them against her chest and breathed. Then the door opened. Resna was not what Sadie had been bracing for. She had imagined, in the way that people imagine confrontations before they happen, imprecisely and with too much drama, that her stepmother would arrive as something monstrous, cold-faced and satisfied with herself. The version of Resna she had constructed in her mind over 3 months of running and planning had been almost mythological in her malice. The woman who stood in the doorway was simply a woman in a good dress, with careful posture, and eyes that moved quickly over the scene. Sadie with the documents, Caius standing near the window, the 2 guards at the door, and arrived at an assessment with the speed of someone who had been managing situations all her life. "Sadie," she said. Her voice was exactly as Sadie remembered, measured, moderate, containing no warmth and no particular cruelty, simply the flat efficiency of someone who had long since stopped feeling the need to perform emotion for an audience. "Resna," Sadie said, "those documents aren't yours to remove. They have my name on them," Sadie said, "in my father's hand. That makes them mine in any court that still functions on law rather than pack politics." Resna's eyes moved to Caius. Something happened in her expression, the first thing that resembled a real reaction, a tightening, subtle and quickly controlled. "I don't know who you've brought with you," she said, "but this is Ashvale territory, and what you're doing is legal," Caius said. He spoke for the first time since they'd entered the keep, and the single word landed in the room with a weight entirely disproportionate to its size. He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, near the window, and looked at Resna with the pale silver eyes and the absolute stillness of a man who had never needed volume to be heard. Resna looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Sadie. "You don't understand what you're starting," she said. And in that moment, just that moment, the mask slipped enough to show something underneath it that was not confidence. It was calculation reassessing itself. A woman who had planned carefully for years, suddenly standing in a room where the plan had encountered something she hadn't accounted for. "I understand exactly what I'm starting," Sadie said. "I'm finishing what you started. I'm just doing it correctly." They were in the carriage, and through the gates within the hour. It had not been simple. There had been a confrontation in the corridor, with 2 of Ashvale's guard, the contingency Caius had anticipated, that had required a careful and tense negotiation involving the legal documentation, Caius's identity, which he had finally disclosed in full, and which had produced a particular quality of silence in the guard captain that Sadie filed away for later examination, and the regional legal protocols that his man had spent 3 days researching. They had not been stopped. Sadie sat in the carriage with the documents in her lap and her father's inheritance in her hands, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. She turned it over and examined it. It wasn't triumph. Triumph was too clean for what this felt like. It was something more complicated. The satisfaction of retrieval, mixed with the grief of needing to retrieve it, mixed with the first real understanding of how much had been taken and how long ago the taking had begun. She was aware that Caius was watching her. "Edmund," she said, "we still need to go north." 3 days, he said. "We stop at Dravenmore first, to check on Sable. Among other things." He paused. "You need to sleep, Sadie. Properly. Before the next part." She wanted to argue. She looked at him and found that the argument dissolved somewhere between thought and speech, because he was looking at her with that quality of attention that didn't ask anything of her, didn't ask her to be managed or grateful or reassured. just looked at her as though her exhaustion was a fact he was acknowledging rather than a problem he was solving. "Resna knew your name," Sadie said. "When she looked at you. She recognized you." "Yes. Who are you?" "Fully." A pause. The carriage rolled through the darkening afternoon, the bare trees lining the road sliding past the window in gray rows. "Alpha King of the Drave territories," he said. "4 packs under my authority. The Northern Ridge, the Valley Settlements, the Coastal Holds, and the Eastern Forest." He said it the way someone states a practical fact, without apology, without performance. "I've been managing the border situation with Ashvale for 2 years. Your inheritance sits at the center of it." Sadie absorbed this. "That's why Resna's face changed," she said. "When she saw you." "She understood that the calculation had changed," he said. "She'd been operating on the assumption that you were alone." "I was alone." "You're not anymore," he said simply. And then, as though the conversation had reached a natural boundary he was choosing to respect, "Sleep. I'll wake you when we're close." Sadie looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned her head against the carriage wall and closed her eyes. She did not intend to sleep. She was asleep within minutes. She woke to Caius saying her name, quiet, no urgency, and the carriage had stopped. Through the window she could see Dravenmoor's gate, and in the torchlight at the entrance, a shape that resolved itself as her eyes adjusted. Sable was sitting at the gate, waiting, and beside her, pressed against her warm flank with the unsteady, astonished posture of something very new, were 2 small shapes, gray and dark, impossibly small, already attempting the business of existing with the total commitment of the newly born. Sadie pressed her hand over her mouth. "When?" she managed. "Last night, Helda thinks." Caius's voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Unguarded, warm, the voice of a man looking at something that moved him and making no effort to conceal it. "She waited for you." Sadie stepped out of the carriage. Sable looked up at her with the gold eyes, steady and unhurried, and the 2 pups shifted against her side, and Sadie knelt in the cold dirt of the gateway and pressed her forehead gently to Sable's, and felt something in her chest come apart in a way that was not destruction. It was the other kind, the kind that made room. The Eastern Hold was 3 days north of anything that could be called civilization. The road deteriorated steadily as they climbed, first the smooth-packed earth of the main routes, then the rougher track through the pine forest, then something that was barely a road at all, more the memory of one, marked by the compressed passage of supply wagons over years of indifferent maintenance. The trees grew closer together here, older, the kind that blocked out the sky by midday and turned the light beneath them into something gray and permanent. The cold was different too, denser, the kind that had weight. Sadie watched it all through the carriage window and said very little. She was thinking about Edmund at 11, the age he had been when Resna's letter was written. He had been a quiet boy, careful with his words, with her father's particular habit of observing before speaking. He had been fond of the mill at Colwick, had spent summer mornings there watching the wheel turn and asking the miller questions that were more precise than an 11-year-old's questions usually were. She had taught him to read from their mother's books, the ones Resna had moved to the attic in the first year of her residence, saying they were taking up space that was needed. She had not protected him. She had not known to protect him, which was different, and also the same. The carriage hit a rut in the road, and she steadied herself against the wall. Across from her, Caius was reviewing a hand-drawn map with the focused attention he brought to everything, complete, unhurried, as though the task in front of him was the only task that existed. "Tell me about the hold," she said. He looked up. "It houses wards and disputed claim individuals, people whose existence complicates someone's administrative situation." His voice was even, but the word wards carried a particular flatness that told her he found the institution as repugnant as she did. "It's run by a man named Orvin. He answers to the Eastern Pack Council, which has been under Ashvale's influence for the past 4 years. Meaning Ashvale has been paying to keep Edmund there. Meaning Ashvale has been paying to keep Edmund quiet," he said. There's a difference. A kept ward can be released if the right pressure is applied in the right direction. He folded the map. I've sent word ahead. Orvin received a formal communication 2 days ago from my office regarding the legal review of all disputed claim holdings within the Drave adjacent territories. He doesn't know you're coming yourself. No, Kaya said. That will be clarifying for him. The hold was a stone building that had once been a minor garrison fort and had been repurposed without much renovation. The same heavy walls, the same narrow windows that had been designed to keep arrows out rather than light in. The courtyard was swept and cold. A man came out to meet them before the carriage had fully stopped, and by the speed of his emergence and the quality of his composure. Too careful, too ready. Sadie understood that someone had told him something was coming, even if not everything. Orvin was a thin man with the look of someone who had spent years managing discomfort as a professional practice. He processed Caius's identity with a visible effort at steadiness, the kind of steadiness that indicated the opposite of what it performed. My lord, he said. We weren't informed of a personal visit. You were informed of a legal review, Caius said. I'm conducting it personally. I require access to your ward records and the current status of all residents held under disputed claim designation. Of course, if you'll come inside. The ward Edmund Colwick, Sadie said, stepping forward. I want to see him now, before anything else. Orvin looked at her. His eyes made a rapid calculation. The ward is in good health. I didn't ask about his health, Sadie said. I asked to see him. He is my brother, and I am the legal primary heir of the Colwick holdings, and I have documentation that establishes both of those facts. Shall I produce it here in the cold, or will you take me to him? The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. This way, Orvin said. Edmund was in a small room on the 2nd floor. It was not a cell. She had braced herself for a cell, had built one in her imagination over the past 3 days, gray and damp and terrible. But it was close enough in its essentials to make the distinction feel dishonest. Small. A narrow bed. A table with a few books on it. A window high in the wall that admitted light without admitting the world. He was sitting at the table when the door opened, and he looked up, and for a moment, he simply looked at her with the expression of someone whose mind is working very fast to determine whether what they are seeing is real. He had grown. Of course he had grown. 3 years, boys grew. But she had been holding the 11-year-old in her memory, and the boy who rose from the chair was nearly 14, taller, his face longer, with the beginning of the angular quality that their father's face had carried. He looked like their father. She had forgotten how much he looked like their father. Sadie, he said, and his voice cracked on the 2nd syllable, and she crossed the room and put her arms around him and felt him grip her back with the force of someone who had been holding something for a very long time. She did not cry. She had decided she would not cry until this was finished. I'm here, she said. I have the documents. Everything is going to be corrected. He pulled back and looked at her face. His eyes, their father's eyes, gray and steady, moved to the doorway where Caius was standing. He assessed him with the same quick intelligence she remembered, the measuring look of a boy who had learned early that the room's power structures mattered. Who is he? Edmund asked quietly. Someone helping, Sadie said. Caius, from the doorway, said, Your sister is more accurate than most people. That's the complete answer. Edmund looked at him for another moment. Then, with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who has spent 3 years learning to evaluate situations on their current evidence rather than their past expectations, he nodded once. All right, he said. When do we leave? Now, Sadie said. We leave now. Orvin received the full weight of Caius's legal authority in the ground floor receiving room, while Edmund was brought his things, which amounted to very little. The books and a coat and a small wooden figure that Sadie recognized with a tightening throat as something their father had carved. The documentation establishing Caius's jurisdiction over the review, the legal records of Edmund's false classification as an illegitimate ward, the original Colwick inheritance papers bearing their father's seal. All of it was laid on Orvin's desk, with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent days preparing exactly this moment. Orvin signed what he was required to sign. He did not argue. Men like Orvin, Sadie was learning, did not argue when the power differential became sufficiently clear. They simply adjusted. What happened to Resna and Alpha Gideon Ashval in the weeks that followed was not quick. It was thorough. Caius brought the forged transfer documents, the original letters between Resna and Gideon, and the full record of Edmund's illegal detention before the Regional Pack Council, a formal proceeding with witnesses conducted in the Great Hall of the Council seat at Drave, with the methodical procedural weight that made outcomes stick. Sadie was present for all of it. She sat at the table and answered questions directly, and produced documentation when asked, and did not look away from Resna's face across the room when the findings were read. Resna's expression, throughout, remained controlled, until the final finding, the full reversal of the property transfer, the restoration of the Colwick holdings to Sadie's sole ownership, the formal censure of the Ashvale Alpha, and the dissolution of Fenwick's marital claim. At which point, something in her face simply went still in the particular way of someone who has exhausted their available responses. Fenwick was not present. Fenwick had, apparently, left Veldmore Keep the week prior on a journey to the Southern Territories, and had not returned. Whether this was coincidence or foresight, no one said aloud. It didn't matter. He was absent from his own accounting, which was its own verdict. Alpha Gideon Ashvale lost 2 of his 4 territorial designations. His pack council was restructured under regional oversight. It was not destruction. Caius was not a man who destroyed when diminishment and correction would hold. But it was sufficient. It was, Sadie thought, exactly the weight of what had been taken, returned in the currency of consequence. They were back at Dravenmore when Sadie finally found the words. It was evening, and the fire in the library was burning well, and Sable was on the hearthrug with her 2 pups, named by Edmund, with the unsentimental practicality of a boy who liked precision, ash and flint, sleeping against her side. Edmund himself had fallen asleep in the chair nearest the fire with a book open across his chest, and the sight of him, safe, warm, asleep in a chair like a person who had the right to be tired, was something Sadie kept looking at from the corner of her eye. Caius was standing at the window. She went and stood beside him. Outside, snow was falling again, steady and quiet, covering the grounds in clean white that made everything look like it was beginning. "I don't know what to do with gratitude this large," she said. "I've never had to manage it before." He looked at her. In the firelight, his pale eyes were warmer, not silver, something closer to the color of water in autumn. "You don't owe me gratitude, Sadie. You did most of this yourself. I provided the structure. You were the one who—" He paused, choosing, who knew exactly what needed to happen and refused to be argued out of it. "You doubled the gate," she said, "the first night, before I told you anything." "Sable told me enough," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I've been trying to find the place where this stops making sense, where the real reason appears and turns out to be smaller than the apparent one. I've been looking for it since the carriage." "Have you found it?" "No," she said. He turned from the window to face her fully, and the quality of his stillness shifted. Less the stillness of control, more the stillness of someone who has set something down that they've been carrying. "I felt it when Sable came back without moving for 3 days," he said. "I felt it when I followed her tracks to a stable in Grenholt and found a woman keeping her calm through sheer force of decision. I felt it every day in this library watching you take apart a conspiracy that had been built across years, with the methodical focus of someone who had decided that justice was not optional." He paused. "I'm not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. I know what you've come through, and I know that my wanting something from you is the last thing that helps you now." "Caius," she said. "But I would like you to stay," he said. "Not because of the territory, not because of the border, because this house is quieter and more itself with you in it. and that is the most honest thing I know how to say." The fire crackled. One of the pups, Ash or Flint, she couldn't tell from here, made a small sound in sleep and pressed closer to Sable's side. Sadie looked at the man beside her, the man who had spoken to a wolf in the dark, to explain rather than command, who had listened to her fifth contingency and incorporated it without comment, who had stood in Orvan's cold courtyard and let her lead, who had sat across from her in a carriage for weeks and never once made her feel like a problem being solved. She thought about the mate bond. She had felt the edge of it, the pull of it, the thing that Sable had known before either of them did. She had been afraid of it, because the last bond she had trusted had been constructed from lies. But this was not the same thing. This was not destiny operating over her head while she remained unaware. She was standing here with full information, full will, and the particular clarity that comes from having lost enough to know exactly what you value. "I'll stay," she said. "Not because I don't have somewhere else to go. I have the Colwick holdings, and Edmund, and enough legal standing to build whatever I choose." She paused. "I'm staying because I choose to. That's the only reason I'm willing to use." Something moved across his face. Not surprise, not relief, something quieter and more permanent. He reached out and took her hand, and the touch was what it had always been with him. Present, without demand, the kind that asks nothing and offers everything. "That's the only reason I'd accept," he said. Spring came to Dravenmore with the particular insistence of seasons that have been anticipated. The rose bushes in the inner garden, which had stood cut back and patient through the winter, put out leaves in the first warm week, with the decisive energy of things that had simply been waiting for permission. Edmund learned the grounds with the systematic interest of a boy who had spent 3 years in a small room and intended to make thorough use of the world now that it was available to him. He and Hilda had developed a relationship of mutual respect, built on the shared understanding that efficiency was a virtue and sentimentality, a tool to be used precisely rather than constantly. The Colwick Mill was reopened in the second month of spring, under a manager Sadie chose herself, with Edmund's careful input on the mechanical questions. The silver mines on the Drave Ridge were brought back under legitimate operation, the profits flowing to the Colwick accounts that Sadie now managed directly, with full legal standing and the regional council's formal recognition. Sable's pups grew into dogs who believed they owned the library. On a morning in early spring, with the window open to the sound of birds returning to the Dravenmore grounds and the smell of wet earth and new growth coming through on the air, Caius and Sadie made their vows. Not in a great hall, not under 200 eyes, not in a dress chosen by someone else or with flowers that weren't hers. In the library, with Hilda and Edmund as witnesses, with Sable asleep on the hearthrug and the spring light coming in long and gold through the tall windows, with words that they had written themselves because both of them, by now, understood the difference between ceremony and meaning. Edmund, standing beside Hilda with the careful composure of a boy who had decided to be moved by things without being embarrassed by it, held their father's seal, the one Sadie had recovered from the Colwick documents, and watched his sister take the hand of a man who had rebuilt her understanding of what a hand extended in good faith could mean. When it was finished, Hilda produced wine and a look of profound satisfaction that she didn't bother to moderate. Edmund said gravely, "He's better than the last one." Caius looked at him. "That's not a high threshold," Sadie said. "No," Edmund agreed, "but he clears it substantially." There was a moment, late that afternoon, when Sadie stood alone in her father's study, not the one in Veldmore Keep that had been stripped of him and repurposed, but the room at Dravenmore that she had made her own, where his documents now lived in the cabinet she had chosen, and his seal sat on the desk beside her own correspondence, and held the small crescent moon pendant in her palm. She had worn it on her wedding day the first time, and believed she was honoring him. She thought she honored him better now. Not by surviving. Survival was the minimum, the floor, not the achievement. By building something real on top of what he had left her. By knowing the difference between a name on a document and a life that belonged to her. By choosing, with full knowledge and full will, rather than being arranged. She closed her hand around the pendant. Outside, She could hear Edmund arguing good-naturedly with one of the stable hands about something involving the horses, and Caius's voice answering a question from the East Wing Guard, with that characteristic economy of words that got things done without wasting anything, and the sound of Dravenmore in spring, which was the sound of a house that was lived in and known and real. She put the pendant on. It rested against her collarbone, the small crescent moon that was her mother's, and she stood in the afternoon light and understood that the story she had been living, the one that had begun in fear and run through darkness, and arrived here, at this particular spring morning, in this particular room, was finished. Not because nothing else would happen. Things would keep happening. The territories would have their politics, the seasons their demands, Edmund his growing and his becoming, Sable's pups their escalating occupation of every room in the house. But the chapter that had opened the morning she read Mira's note in the too-large bedroom at Veldmore Keep, the chapter of being lost, being taken from, being underestimated and discarded. That chapter was closed. She had closed it herself. That was the part that mattered.